have to unlock this real quick, y'all.
I'm technologically deficient at the best of times, so
You have it at 3.5?
something like that, yeah.
We'll just go.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you all so much for being here. Some of you may know me and some of you may know of me from my time serving on the board here at Texas High Plains Riders. But as she mentioned, I'm Summer Baker, longtime member, first time presenter, just to set your expectations of this presentation. 2 points of order before we get started. First, over the course of 6 years working in a call center, I trained almost 70 new employees for 3 days each. So my voice sometimes dries out after a lot of talking. Do not panic. Frequent, possibly concerningly frequent pauses for water will fix me right up. Second, I have a condition that makes my feet burn if I stand on them for a long time. So although public speakers are supposed to stand through their whole presentation, I may take a seat a few times. Again, do not panic. Your regularly scheduled presenter will resume momentarily. I hope today will be an informative learning experience for you, and not just be me bludgeoning you over the head with a knowledge dump. But I hyperfixate on topics like this one, so I'm very excited to teach you what I know. As we go, there will be opportunities for questions between sections. Please hold your questions until then so I don't get derailed. We'll also take a break and have an interactive session, so don't worry, I will have mercy on your brains. Over the course of writing about 150 flash fics, 60-ish drabbles, essays, articles, blog posts, and a handful of traditionally published short stories, one bit of feedback defined the moment when I went from beginner writer to competent writer. That was hearing the phrase, I really felt like I was there. I started getting this feedback consistently after I decided, among other personal rules, to include the 5 senses in every piece. That was every piece back when I wrote primarily short works, but now that I dabble in longer form writing, I apply this technique to every scene. I still get this feedback from readers, which tells me I'm accomplishing what many writers hope, to spirit readers away on their words. But after that decision, I spent a lot of time refining this technique, figuring out how to make adding the 5 senses a smooth integration that enhances a piece. In this craft, learning to write well can be like learning to speak a foreign language. Some just need immersion in conversation to start picking up the linguistic nuances, while others need to understand the underlying mechanics of what governs verb conjugation or article gender. Again, don't worry, we won't be going into anything so complex. But likewise, without conscious understanding of the reasoning behind applying a rule like include all 5 senses, writers may intuit the intent behind such a pithy statement, or they may need more explanation. I'm among the second type. And not only do I write, I copy, edit, and edit for quality assurance for a living. That means I spend all day, every day, examining and thinking about the minutiae of sentence structure, which I can do because I already flailed and flopped around trying to understand trite little advice phrases like include all 5 senses, among others. Since I've done all that work, I want to share my understanding with you so you can apply the 5 senses to your fiction, your poetry, your memoirs, your journalism, your travel writing, and whatever else as an informed mechanical choice. Writing with the 5 senses bridges the gap between your imagination and your reader's mind through shared sensory experience. To pull off that trick, we'll first examine misguided application of sensory detail and methods of appropriate integration. Then we'll talk about best practices for prompting inclusion of the senses using setting. And lastly, we'll cover the frequency at which each sense should appear while applying what we've learned through accompanying short exercises. So let's get started on our deep dive into the sensory mechanics of creating vivid experiences your readers can see, hear, touch, smell, and taste. Some advocate against putting every sense in a scene. This opposition, I suspect, comes from a fear of contrivance. That is, of adding senses just for the sake of inclusion rather than for enhancement. When advising writers to incorporate the senses into a piece, you can get some stilted work from someone who doesn't understand why they're employing a particular technique. Here's an example of rough writing focused just on throwing in a couple of sentences. She smelled coffee in the air. It was coming from the cafe counter where she ordered a triple shot espresso. I'm not saying this writing is bad. In fact, the style choices made here might be just what the piece needs given context. But it's not an example of my best work. If not for the expectation to incorporate the senses, inclusion of these lines might never have happened, which would have been for the best because they cause problems in a few ways. First, the mention of the scent stands on its own, when this detail could better support the narrative woven into sentences that carry more import and weight. If you're writing tight, and you should always be writing tight, avoiding wordiness isn't just for short pieces. An entire sentence devoted to a sense, and only that sense, is a great opportunity to lose your reader's attention. Second, the details of the coffee smell and the POV character's preferred coffee type, though revealing of her character, are wasted on what amounts to a bridging passage. They would better serve worked in during the central focus of the scene. Unless conflict is planned to happen at the counter, she might as well be placed at her mark in the cafe when these details are revealed. Third, this passage introduces the sense using a filter word, smelled. As a quick sidebar, filter words weaken the entire sentence by separating the reader from the character's experience and by extension from the narrative as a whole. Filter words include any words that tell readers what the character is experiencing instead of just showing that experience with narrative description. Such filter words include saw or watched, heard, felt or touched, smelled, and tasted. For your reference, you can find this list on your handout. In the example, the filter word comes from describing the sense by starting with the subject, that being she, here. I don't want to get too much more technical than that, because this subtopic could stand as an entire lecture on its own. But if you catch yourself including a filter word, consider creative possibilities for rearranging the sentence. Fourth, the example includes passive writing in the form of the being verb was, which introduces the gerund coming. As a quick summary, being verbs tend to weaken the sentence through uninspired verb choice. These include be, was, been, is, were, am, and are. Again, for your reference, you can also find this list on your handout. Likely you've all heard variations on the discussion about being verbs in passive writing versus active writing, so I wasn't even going to include this issue in the example. But a huge part of incorporating the senses with style, which we'll talk about in a minute, comes from treatment of verb choices. Fifth, and this is the last instance of me disparaging my own writing, the sense description is plain. There's no need for elaborateness just for the sake of including a sense, but there's also no need for boring description just for the sake of including a sense. You have to use this tool with intent. Intention can take many forms, but above all, specificity rules. Even just switching out coffee for roasting coffee beans evokes a greater sensory experience in the minds of readers. As you can see, forcibly adding sensory detail without understanding why can impact a piece detrimentally, hurt more than help. Of course, such mistakes would result in resistance to including all 5 senses in every scene. Likely, foregoing the technique altogether might be considered better than the alternative, harming the narrative. Drink time.
H2.
Obviously, I advocate for putting every sense in a scene. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here on a Saturday morning when we could be writing. But that's for 2 reasons. The first being that feedback I mentioned before. It's hard to argue with readers, hearing readers tell you they felt like they were really into your story. But my other reason comes from the results of the challenge, because finding ways to include all 5 senses in every scene can challenge you. Not only must you incorporate the senses with purpose, you must do so with grace. That grace comes from creative sentence structure. Here is an example of how creative sentence structure can look with regard to incorporating sensory detail. Heat from a triple shot of bitter espresso warmed her fingers through the smooth teacup cradled in her palms as a certain former best friend strutted up to the counter. At the clanking pull of a lever from the barista, the sweetness of 3 pumps of vanilla squirted into perfectly good coffee wafted throughout the cafe. That woman always did like her sugar too much. Side note, I am already aware that the details of the coffee making process here are incorrect and out of order. That is purely for the sake of example. But also for this reason, always fact check your work or get a copy editor to do it for you. Normally, I wouldn't suggest cramming every single sentence into one paragraph, especially since the mention of the clanking lever is a bit clunky, but I wanted all the sentences here for the example. Now, by following a few loose personal rules, which I will elaborate on soon, we've accomplished a lot in just a 3-sentence passage. Later in this discussion, we'll go over the order of frequency that a sentence typically appears so you can work out a reasonable ratio of each to include in your piece. But here we get sight through the mention of the former bestie strutting and the barista pulling a lever, sound from the lever pull, touch from the heat of the coffee and smooth texture of the teacup, scent from the vanilla, and taste from the hint at bitter espresso and vanilla sweetness. We also get much more than just senses from this paragraph. In the first line comes the conflict of the scene, a former best friend who just entered the setting. The flavor of the espresso implies the bitter personality of the POV character. Her opinion on her former bestie's inclinations informs us of her viewpoints, and the sugary preference of the bestie hints at a contrast in character between the two. As opposed to in our previous example, none of these sentences get their own sentences. They aren't introduced through filter words, nor do they introduce passive writing. They're specific. And most importantly, the pacing does not slow down to mention the senses. Rather than disrupting the flow, sprinkling them throughout other sentences already doing important jobs moves the narrative forward. Tricks for achieving graceful sentence structure is a whole other topic, but with regard to incorporating sensory detail, here's a quick rundown of my process. Swap out being verbs for active verbs. Active verbs are literally any other verb than being verbs. Sometimes the active verb you could choose already appears in whatever gerund follows was even. So in the first example, it was coming from the counter could become it came from the counter. Already that improves the power of the sentence. Avoid filter words by changing the subject of the sentence. Describe the sense via focus on a detail that isn't the POV character. So instead of she smelled coffee, changing the subject to sweetness provides us with sweetness wafted throughout the cafe. We know she smelled the sweetness because of the presence of the description. If she couldn't smell the scent, the description wouldn't exist. Weave sensory detail in and among and around descriptions of the central conflict. Accomplish this by way of adjectives, dependent clauses, transitions, and a support for setting descriptions. Generally, hang the senses on other details. If you need to give a sense its own sentence, save those instances for when doing so will provide the most narrative impact. Trade in vagueness for specificity. Especially avoid the word it where possible. Without digging all the way down to purple prose, the more exact word choices you can make, the stronger a connection your sensory descriptions will make in your reader's mind. On this point, nouns are your friend. Though that addresses all the criticisms I brought for my first writing sample, I have a bonus secret tip to share with you, one I hold to myself to. Avoid starting sentences with the. If you, I, have to break this rule, hide your, my, shame by burying the offending sentence somewhere in the middle of the paragraph. This one is a personal rule I've never heard anyone else mention, but its application works well for encouraging creative sentence construction that fits with the rest of these subpoints. Watch out though, dangling modifiers can result from starting sentences with gerunds that don't follow with the main clause's subject. Right now, are there any questions about what we've covered so far? I will stare at you until you ask me something.
Can Can you give us an example of that last point?
Avoiding starting a sentence with the. So say that you've got a sentence that's, the leaves were green. You could change it to, bright sunlight filtered through green leaves. The idea is to avoid the, and when you make that your focus of starting your sentences, it forces you to stop and think about a different way that you could start that sentence stronger. Especially because if you get into the habit of starting sentences with the, as an editor, I have often seen paragraphs where just 3 or 4 sentences start with the in a row. And that's boring for your reader to read. So, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Alrighty. All right. Whew, that was a lot, which is why all of these subpoints are on your reference sheet. You may, in fact, be thinking that was too much, but life is short and fast. You may never get this opportunity to talk about this again, so I'm giving you everything I know while we have the chance. But now that we understand not only the importance of including all the sentences with, including the 5 sentences with intent, but how to do so, we're going to talk about how senses inform setting and setting inform senses. You can't have one without the other, but the good news is that means you can approach including sensory detail in your narrative from either direction. In our previous example of stronger sensory writing, to have the warmth of a heated beverage, the bitterness of espresso, the smell of vanilla, and the texture of a smooth teacup, we needed our scene set inside a coffee shop. Deciding on this setting allowed description of the POV character's surroundings to flow around the central conflict, the appearance of a former bestie. We even made the setting and the senses work double duty by revealing the former bestie's tastes and the POV character's opinion of those traits through the vanilla scent. Great time. But sensation must come from somewhere, so its intentional inclusion encourages building the setting up for your scene. As the appearance of a former best friend and all the impending conflict that entails can happen anywhere, your chosen setting should also support your goals for a given scene. Since senses also inform scene choice, you can let writing your way through the scene, with sensory detail included, guide you toward your setting choice. Need to give your POV character a swoopy stomach for the next paragraph to work? Put them on a roller coaster, put them on a cliff top, put them on a boat. The rest of the setting fills itself in, lending you ample options for sensory descriptions to convey the scene in nauseating detail. On the flip side, choosing your setting provides opportunities for inclusion of sensory detail. Bolstering the flow of the narrative using the senses, or even figuring out the narrative at all, comes much more easily with setting decided from the start. For example, in script writing, every scene must have 2 details noted from the top, place and time. But you can work in even more interesting and relevant sensory detail from your setting by making a few additional decisions. For those of us who get decision paralysis or tend to write scenes in white space, the following series of steps makes choosing setting, by extension limiting sensory detail options, easier. That's going to be season, weather, temperature, time, setting, characters, and objects. And each of these flows into the next. Starting broadly with season lets us know what types of weather we'd probably be dealing with, which informs likely temperature ranges. And time of day further limits temperature possibilities as well as daylight amount and quality, and if any. Deciding on a setting can be as broad as Planet X or Australia, or as specific as that motel I stayed in during the fall of '99 in Colorado Springs. But whether broad or specific, setting limits possibilities with regard to weather and temperature depending on the season, since Christmas in Australia is very different from Christmas in Serbia, while narrowing down the possibility of what characters and objects might appear there. So if you decide to set your scene on a snowy spring morning in New Mexico, you can note the weather as unusual but not impossible for the time of year to kick off your story, if you want to. This means you've got perhaps low daylight for sight details, cold or wet for touch, and maybe damp dirt or sand for scent. Drilling down a little further could set the story in the Capulin Volcano State Park in northeast New Mexico. Maybe in the ranger station, maybe in the visitor center, maybe somewhere outside, like at the top of the caldera or in the forested area at the base. Now, you perhaps got snow clinging to green leaves for sight, the noise of a backup generator if the power has gone out, co-workers talking about this odd weather, or a trapped tourist yelling for help as sound. Maybe the flavor of stale almond in a protein bar for taste because there wasn't time to grab breakfast with all the yelling trapped tourists. No matter which direction you choose to approach description from, you can get to senses via setting or get to setting via the senses. Each is inextricable from the other. But now that we're feeling a little more confident about using sensory detail to build setting and vice versa, a note of caution for you. Watch out for the sensory cliches a setting may tempt you with. Write what you know is another pithy bit of advice that often leads writers astray. Because of this saying, many a writer has set many a scene inside a coffee shop and probably given the POV character their favorite latte to drink. For better or worse, coffee shops are what we know. Even I fell into putting my examples in one. Coffee shops are not a bad setting, but like any setting, your choice should enhance the narrative. Your sensory details should also accomplish the same. So be wary of the well-worn path, especially with regard to your own narrative habits. For example, while revising my upcoming novel and stories, I realized I often relied on dust getting in my character's mouth for the sense of taste and had to switch up some of those instances. Part of that comes from setting many of the scenes outside. Since I edit crime fiction, I cannot count the number of times the sense of taste has come from a terrible cup of coffee or the sense of touch has come from a gold mug. So at this point, are there any questions about what we've just talked about?
Just curious, can you suggest any type of exercises like a singer will stretch his vocals?
Like a what?
Any type of exercises to help with kind of revision or put, I think and bring myself into my character's shoes once he or she's having a sensory, expressing a sensory experience. Would there be any kind of exercises?
Oh, to plan for that? To get yourself to do it?
Just open up your mind to really.
We are going to go over some exercises here in a second. Not really quite what you're talking about, but the main point is that I simply keep in mind as I'm going that each sense needs to appear at least once. So that whenever you keep that in mind as you write, that will help prompt you and motivate you to include senses as you're going. Or if you're going through revisions and you ask yourself, does every sense appear in this scene? And if you say, no, taste isn't here or smell isn't here, that will prompt you to go through and look for a place where you could incorporate those details. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so that wasn't so bad, right? Oh, yeah, what's up, Kim?
I just have one other thing. You had mentioned writing in white space, and I think I understand what you're saying, but is that are you just saying that the scene could take place anywhere?
Yeah, so whenever, and my best friend has this problem, she's admitted to it, so that's the first step to recovery. Whenever you're writing in white space, it's just that you generally have your characters, you have your conflict, things are happening, there is a scene happening here, but there's no description of where they are. There's no description of interacting with the environment, so there's no way, there's just nothing for the reader to imagine around your characters. So that's probably what you were thinking of, right?
That's what I was
Yeah.
making sure that's what you were saying.
Yes, ma'am, Cheryl.
Well, I like what you were saying, Summer, about not being cliche and throwing these flowery words. And it's funny because I'm still trying to edit what I'm working on.
Uh-huh.
And I was flowing with this sentence, but it needs to fit. You know what I mean? It just to have the swirling such and such and all of this, and then, then you're trying to work through what is actually happening in that scene. I ended up taking it out because I think straightforward, I love that, sensory and all this, but I think we have to be careful to not just throw anything in because it sounds, that sounds so artistic and very, flowery. So I appreciate what you mentioned because I did that. I took out.
Yeah,
I
and it
took out
always
some of the
hurts when you
things.
have to take it back out. But, yeah, so that's actually extremely important, is deciding where is a good place for this. I am guilty of putting too many sentences in one sentence and having to cut some of those out. Because again, like you were saying, the sentences have to be doing a job. And also they have to not be detracting from the rest of the story, which was kind of what we were talking about in that first example, which is that because that description kind of stood on its own, it was weak, it had filter words, whatever, that was a distraction from the rest of the narrative and slowed down the pacing. So same thing goes for, even as you are doing everything that I've talked about, you still got to be careful to not overdo it or to not put sentences where they don't belong. Yes, ma'am.
Is it hard then to avoid adverbing too much and things like that and trying to get into sentences?
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty good at avoiding adverbs. That's another personal rule that I'm not going to talk about today. But if you can avoid adverbs and try to use adjectives instead, so instead of, what's a good example here? The leaves glowed greenly. That's not anything anyone would say, but you could change that greenly to the green leaves, something else. So adverbs are like the gerunds that I mentioned, which are words that end in ing, coming after a being verb, already being something that you could use to change to an active verb. Same goes for adverbs. If you find that you have an adverb in your sentence, it can almost always be changed to an adjective to make your sentence stronger. Was that confusing? No? Okay. Is that anybody else? Ready. Let's see. That wasn't nearly as bad as that first heavy-duty section, but now that we understand the entwined nature of sensory detail and setting, I'll show you a little mercy and give you a 15-minute break. When we come back, we'll cover the order of frequency each of the senses typically appears in, while practicing a little of what we learned with some writing exercises.
Back to work.
You can go ahead and start that.
Yeah.
And it's not all, husbands are all bad, wives are all bad.
Alrighty, here we go. When including the 5 senses in each of your scenes, you want to provide them either as they're needed to enhance the narrative or as frequently as a reader would experience those senses in life. Again, the purpose of including sensory detail is to bridge the gap between your reader's personal experience and the scene you want to plant in their mind. So while loose, there is an order to how often you can deploy each scene. Conscious understanding of this order will help you avoid overuse of one or underuse of another. From most common to least, we'll dig into each sense, then practice writing description with that sense before moving on to the next. Those practice spaces are available on one of the pages of your handout. Don't feel pressured to pull off feats of excellent prose or poetry during these exercises. No one will read them. They're just to help you connect what you've learned today with physical action. To absolutely no one's surprise, sight appears most frequently, especially in narrative. Every bit of description that isn't translated through one of the other senses comes via the sense of sight. That's why filter words like saw or watched, etc., as we mentioned before, are the least necessarily elements of description ever. But beyond just describing action, you can deploy specificity to empower descriptions of what your character sees. Colors, sizes, physical traits. For the love of reading, please describe your characters. Even textures. Adjectives are your best friend here. So for this 5-minute exercise, describe the sense of sight from the point of view of a camera. Interpret the type of camera however you like. How are we feeling? All good? Alrighty. Next most frequent behind the sense of sight, behind sight comes the sense of sound. Naturally, dialogue and accompanying tags describing tone and modulation count here. Crashes and bangs also tend to find their way into action scenes. But hearing characters should also pick up everyday noises. The click of an object set down, wind rushing through leaves, footsteps crunching against gravel, clothes rustling as they're put on. Opportunities abound to integrate natural, common sounds your reader would expect to hear if standing within the scene. So for the next 5-minute exercise, describe the sense of sound from the point of view of an owl, an animal that has some of the best hearing on Earth. Josh. This time, next time.
I'll hum a few bars.
Alrighty. So while smell vies with touch for the most common sense behind sight and sound, I argue that touch comes next. Characters who touch objects or are characters moving and living within a scene. But touch goes beyond hands as other elements of the world act on the character, such as through the chill of a snowflake landing on an arm, the pinch of new shoes on feet, or the sting of a wasp inside your shirt. This happened to me once. But touch goes even further than skin contact, interacting with both sight and sound. For example, hearing the rub of a finger drawing a smiley face in the seam on a window suggests the smoothness of the glass and the wetness of the condensation. For the next 5-minute exercise, describe the sense of touch from the point of view of a shoe, a garment that experiences some of the greatest variety in textures. And away we go. That's it for that 5 minutes. Betty, your shirt is so sparkly. I just love looking at it. All right. Make sure I'm the right one. Although scent tends to come up when something bad has happened or in close proximity to a love interest, even though we lack the sense of smell animals tend to have, we still pick up scent wherever we go. To us, however, smells are an afterthought. They work in tandem with the other senses to fill in a picture of our surroundings. Because scent takes a backseat to sight, sound, and touch, smells should be described sparingly. Though we smell all the time, we generally only notice scents when they change. So for the next 5 minutes, describe the sense of smell from the point of view of a shark, an animal that has some of the best olfactory senses on the planet. Come up here and hang out. You didn't know I was going to make you work. Alrighty, last one. One of my favorite party tricks is to point out that if you look at any object in a room, you know how that object tastes. Seriously, try it for yourself real quick. That's because before your brain developed enough to start forming conscious memories, as a baby and a toddler, you licked everything. You were interacting with the world through every sense available to you. But in adulthood, taste tends to come last. Obviously, we're not licking everything in sight anymore, so not many opportunities come up to taste beyond eating food or drinking a beverage, even in narrative description. Or do they? Consider the way breathing near a lot of metal, such as with your head under the hood of a car, tastes metallic, or how dust settles on your tongue on a windy day, a thing we're all familiar with. There's even the saltiness of sweat during hard work. While incorporating taste into a scene represents more of a struggle than the other senses, there are ways. For this reason, I suggest only including taste in a scene once, unless more would enhance the intent of your narrative. But taste should also still appear at least once. You just have to be clever about how you integrate flavor. So for our final 5-minute exercise, describe the sense of taste from the point of view of an earthworm, an animal that tastes using its whole body. See in a scene goes sight, sound, touch, smell, and taste. To clarify, I don't mean these senses should appear in this order, only that they should appear this often. with sight the most frequent, and taste the least. But again, each of the 5 senses ought to be described at least once in a scene, if not more. This has been great. Are there any questions about what we've just covered or any of the rest of today's presentation? I will stare at you until you ask a question. What's up, Cheryl?
Well, actually, the fact that you mentioned shark is interesting because this is the 50th anniversary of the Jaws.
Oh, no.
Yeah. I know that has nothing to do with what we're doing, but when you mentioned shark, I saw that this is the 50th anniversary.
I feel edified knowing it, so thanks.
We're gonna need a bigger book.
Cindy, what did you have?
So anyway, that's just,
Sydney?
It's not really a question, but I just don't know if anybody else had this problem. When I was doing taste, it was hard for me to differentiate between taste and smell as I was writing.
Really?
I was describing things a worm found in a compost pile, and I kept thinking.
That's what I would have done.
Yeah.
That stinks.
You can-
Exactly. It was hard for
Interesting.
me to get down to that he was smelling it and not tasting it, or tasting it and not smelling it without saying tasting.
Which you would think that, like, it's interesting to consider it from the earthworm's point of view, because we would think a compost bin might stink. Actually, they usually don't. They're usually just kind of earthy.
Right.
But an earthworm would never think that. It would just be, if it could smell, it would just think, this is an interesting smell. Like if we smelled cake, probably. But yeah, so I can see how that would be tricky to do that from that point of view.
It might be a location thing, because came to my mind is just an earthworm just moving through the ground, like in your lawn. And so it kind of presented itself more sequentially in my mind, different kinds of tastes that might come through.
Taste of dirt, taste of roots. taste
Yeah,
of other mud.
exactly.
Yeah,
Taste of water.
yeah,
May I share what I wrote on that?
yeah, certainly.
Serving cherries spilled drink soaked into the dirt. I needed to move away as quickly as possible. I am allergic to cherries.
Unique. I love it.
All right.
Just imagine somebody breaks a bottle of rum.
Lovely. Thank you so much. I will leave you with a final point. If your narrative feels stilted, flat, or unable to move forward, remember to start working in sensory detail, whether by using the senses to build setting or choosing a setting to reveal the senses. Including the 5 senses in every scene with intent doesn't just build bridges in your reader's mind, doing so builds bridges in your own. Thank you so much.
I just wanted to say thank you so much. This was so informative